All right, so we are live. My name is Karina Klingman. I am a co-founder of the Collaboratory and the founder and CEO of Recruitomics Consulting, and I am here with Carlene, and Carlene is one of our senior recruiters. Carlene, you want to tell us about your background?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Carlene. My background is as a molecular biologist. I earned my PhD in pathobiology and molecular medicine, studying drug development, specifically for cystic fibrosis, so doing genotype-specific drug development, personalized medicine, and things like that. I did my postdoc actually in chemistry, developing mass spec methods for continuing to characterize patient mutations and improving therapeutic response. And then I was a research assistant professor for a year, coordinating clinical trials in the same field of personalized medicine, but more generally for a variety of pulmonary diseases. But during that time, as a grad student and as a postdoc, and even when I was a professor, I was really passionate about science communication and connecting people and really trying to understand how do we convert like basic academic research into a way that's accessible and that makes it outside of the academic complex that's so hard to escape. So I was really excited to get involved in recruiting and connecting people in a way that they could really take their exciting new inventions and bring it to a larger scale and get it to more people. So I've really enjoyed being able to work with our many clients and talking to candidates on a regular basis about their dreams as a scientist and the different ways that they want to have a big impact. So super happy to be here to talk to you about biotech and give candidates a deeper understanding of what startups look like currently in the booming field of biotech.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So you have a very deep scientific background. How do you think that has set you up for recruiting in this space?
Yeah, for sure. I think that when it comes to recruiting within the biotech space, things are evolving so quickly, especially, for example, in terms of gene editing, right? Like what type of editing tools are you using? What type of delivery systems are you using? And so when it comes to talking to candidates and really understanding, okay, you use CRISPR, but what's novel about your use of CRISPR? How are you evolving on the field? I think my scientific expertise guides me in my ability to ask those kinds of questions because I feel like when candidates interview, they're in their work for so long that the novelty and the specific ways in which their work is novel kind of, you know, gets a little bit more faded because they're so used to this thing, even though it's brand spanking new to everybody else. So sometimes, candidates are really well versed at kind of identifying what's unique about their background. And other times, that novelty is in there, and we just try to help candidates figure out how to highlight, what's so interesting and innovative about their work.
Yeah, really pull out those details. I love that. Okay, we are talking a little bit today about some of the trends we're seeing in the biotech sector, some of the things that are evolving there, and maybe some lesser known jobs that folks coming out of maybe academia haven't heard of. We certainly hadn't when we were in academia, had no idea how the whole drug process, works, how things are developed from A to Z. Let's start right now with some of the trends that we're seeing. What are you seeing right now that clients are really asking for? Or like what kind of scientific skills are really hot?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say some of the biggest growing fields currently in biotech, especially for startup companies, I'll just list a few here before going into a little bit more detail. Artificial intelligence, of course, that's really hot just in terms of all of different types of fields, like using Chat GPT or Dolly, to manipulate text or visuals. But we're seeing the same in terms of how do we manage all of the information that we get from sequencing or modeling. And that brings me into the next category, which is big data analytics. How do we process, millions of data points in terms of patient data, or looking at, microbiome data. That's the kind of really data rich tools that we have. But trying to figure out, okay, how do we extract particular observations in a way that's actually useful is an entire field in and of itself. And then, of course, I discussed earlier gene editing technologies. I think right now, a big part of the field is not only increasing efficiency for gene editing, but also improving delivery, right? It's one thing to deliver to the eye, it's a whole different thing to deliver to the inside of the lungs. And then precision medicine, I think that's an interesting field, both in terms of like the logistics of it, how is it possible to study a mutation that only occurs in 100 patients worldwide? What are the barriers in terms of working within a clinic, within sharing patient samples? And then also, on a completely different level, biomanufacturing, the logistics of that, the scaling up of that, the types of skill sets involved in, working with hundreds of gallons of bacteria or virus, which is something that we're seeing with things like the COVID vaccine. Manufacturing on that scale, I think, has really changed the landscape in terms of resources and what people prioritize. And then things like microfluidics innovations in terms of, with 3D printing and other kinds of manufacturing capabilities changing. I think microfluidics innovations can really change things in terms of, during really basic drug characterization to things like optimizing drug delivery as well. So I covered kind of a ton of different things there, but we can kind of go stepwise through all those different fields and talk about specific kinds of strategies that companies have been employing, and the more basic, but also some of the more surprising career paths that might exist within each of those fields.
Yeah, that's a great overview. It has been a really wild ride. You mentioned the COVID vaccine and all of the manufacturing around that. One thing that I remember very vividly from recruiting during that era of that manufacturing ramp up was the incredible shift in priorities and people suddenly needing to do that massive scale manufacturing yesterday, and how the public demand for that. We are seeing now, as you mentioned, this that AI is ushering in another kind of reprioritization of how we even think about science. So yeah, I'd love to dig into some of those things in light of AI. So let's start with big data, looking at giant data sets, and then how that kind of relates back to human medicine.
Yeah, for sure. The first thing that comes to mind for me, especially based off of my background in drug discovery, is, usually when people try to do some type of target identification, they have access to these massive libraries of either actual small molecules or just, the actual libraries of different compounds, so more, the theoretical molecules that might exist. And oftentimes they can get this from the NIH, or maybe they're able to purchase libraries from different companies that they're trying to collaborate with. So, it's one thing to kind of sit down at your computer and try to plug and chug through a variety of different compounds that have similar structural motifs. It's another thing to try to extrapolate that to a variety of different targets, maybe even thousands of targets at once. And so being able to extract functional data from that, I can't remember what that chart is, but it's like, on average, it takes like 7 or more years to go from like early target identification to an actual molecule that's also bioavailable and non-toxic, using big data analytics to decrease the risk of you ending up with a few lead candidates that actually aren't practical. And I think big data analytics gives us the opportunity to screen even more molecules with even more targets, and really increasing your odds of getting a good hit. And I think in terms of big data, not only do you have all this information, but I think if you're a wet bench scientist, it's really hard to appreciate, what that actually looks like from a hardware perspective. So, it can actually cost a lot of money to be able to access time on a server that's powerful enough to actually do that analytics. So I think when it comes to candidates who might be really marketable, I think, just understanding how to navigate databases, how to pull information from different areas. I think what's really spectacular about candidates in this field is that they're often wet bench scientists who sat down one day as a third or fourth year PhD student and said, hey, I'm going to teach myself Python.
Yep.
Or, hey, I've been characterizing this protein for years and I don't really understand, the characteristics of a proper drug binding pocket. So I think candidates in that field have a lot more grit than someone who is more of a traditional molecular biology background. And I think students really leaning into that, and not just applying for jobs and saying like, hey, I know Python, or hey, I know how to use AWS, but marketing themselves more so as, a really strategic learner. But also, I think what's interesting when I look at a resume for someone who's a dry bench scientist is that most of them are able to list, 10, 15 different programs that they know how to use, and all different kinds of programs that they've been able to teach themselves or collaborate with. One of my actual students, actually, when I was a postdoc, is traditionally a wet bench scientist, but he taught himself. And so we were studying a specific protein, and he was working with a large library, but was also having to go through and manually put in different patient mutations and analyzing mass spec data. So that's the direction that I think big data analytics, that's where they are right now. I can imagine, I can't imagine where they're going from there. I'm sure they're dealing with the same kinds of innovation and also interesting problems that we will see with sequencing and things like that.
Absolutely. You're bringing back all kinds of memories. I'm envisioning this small molecule library that I got from the Broad during my PhD, and I don't remember how many compounds was in it, but like 12,000. And so it was just stacks and stacks of 96 well plates.
Oh God.
And I screened those suckers. And now I mean, I know that every generation of scientists says like, oh, if only I had these tools that I'm seeing now. But wow, the impact that this generation of scientists is going to have it's mind boggling. It's so exciting. It's so exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the lifelong learner bit. I think if nothing else, that is what scientists are trained to do, right? We are very mentally flexible, and sometimes it's, well, I got to learn this new skill so I can move forward. And that is something we do want to highlight on that resume. And I think we have some good techniques for that. Let's see. Next up, let's talk a little bit. You had mentioned about the some of the more materials-based innovations that we're seeing, maybe microfluidics. I know that that's a passion of yours. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the industry there and what candidates might bring to the table?
Yeah, for sure. Microfluidics is a really interesting field because there are so many different ways in which you're doing like really basic research. So just understanding the characteristics of vessels and how delivery might change in that way versus a microfluidic system that you might actually implement in an in vivo model and things like that. So I think it's one of those fields that requires a real constellation of skill sets. So it's both biomaterials and engineering, but also still having that really strong foundation in cell biology and understanding, the infrastructure, the architecture of certain types of physiologies. And one example that I can think of is modeling the blood-brain barrier and how different kinds of infectious diseases might respond in that type of microenvironment. Microfluidics could also be used to study things like changes in vasculature for different tumor model systems. And also basically just any context in which you do have some type of external and internal environment where you're thinking about things like diffusion and other types of complications in terms of delivery. I think microfluidics might be a field that, once you consider it, seems really obvious. But in reality, I think it's something that might not necessarily be deployed in every context. And I think an example of some careers in that role is, grad students or other people who might be working in biomedical engineering. I think it's really cool when people know how to work with 3D printers. So people who are experimenting or even developing new types of scaffolding, whether or not it's some type of like gelatin or like agar or extracellular matrix based scaffolding. I think usually people think of, oh yeah, like some type of medical intervention, but in reality that those kinds of things can also be applied for things such as like plant biology and agricultural research. So I think microfluidics will be kind of the silent game changer.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a couple of clients on our radar that work within that ag science space. That's really up and coming, isn't it? We're seeing a lot of companies that are, experimenting with how do we make our food supply better, more nutritious, easier to grow. And I think that that's going to be a space where a lot of people land, which is interesting.
Yeah, and definitely more sustainable. I think, especially out in California, when we think about some of the most popular or most fruitful startup companies that are receiving kind of a higher proportion of the overall startup kind of environment of funding are companies that are dedicated to fighting climate change.
Mhm.
And I think, there's so many different reasons to invest in that type of work. And I think at this stage, in terms of technology development, these are the types of tools that will be applied in so many different ways. So I think it's really a win-win for everyone when we invest in those kinds of technologies.
Absolutely. I love it. All right. Do you want to dive into some jobs that maybe people out there don't know about and some career paths that might be worth taking a look at?
Yeah, for sure. I can think of several that I was just like, it makes sense that that exists, but I'd never heard of it,
Yeah.
especially since I was coming straight from academia. Quality control and quality assurance, the thing that keeps us all safe and that makes sure that products are consistent. And that looks different in every context, right? So when I think of biomanufacturing, so companies that might be scaling up some type of bacteria or virus, think about vaccines and all the different things that may need to be filtered down. So making sure, working hand in hand with things like process development and analytical development to make sure that each batch is consistent. And that, for example, you want to make sure that if you're growing bacteria, that you want like consistent clonality. You want to make sure that in terms of manufacturing, just for like efficiency, that, you don't have reduction in, the overall concentration of bacteria or virus that you might be producing. And so, for a lot of the scientists out there who, maybe that early troubleshooting phase of doing research was, let's say like anxiety inducing or just like really frustrating, being able to work in quality and, having that personality of like being really satisfied with consistency and, helping optimize SOPs and things like that. I think that's the type of position that would a lot of people would feel very natural to them.
Yeah.
And I think, being able to identify that portion of doing science is something that I don't think a lot of people know like even exists. And then in terms of things like regulatory, right? So you might be involved in like hardcore wet bench science, but there are tons of people who are able to transition to doing the kind of more logistical thinking that's involved, especially in terms of things going from early R&D to actually making it into the clinic. So people who, you might have been doing drug development, but now you're actually concerned with, okay, what are the logistics of, running a clinical trial? What are the logistics of actually getting approval so that the drug that your group has worked so hard on to develop actually makes it to the millions of people who are suffering from that disease? So I think regulatory can be really satisfying for people who are looking for that bigger picture. And it's also, a really fluid career path. If you're doing regulatory for one field, I think it's also like a pretty small field. Like I think if you have that type of skill set, that you would be marketable to many different kinds of companies.
Absolutely.
Let me see. What else? Yeah,
I think
quality
you touched on
regulatory.
analytical, and we could sort of
Mhm.
piggyback there. I think one of my very early clients was I was working with their analytical development group, and I remember having to make the mental shift in how I was even talking to candidates because they were looking for somebody who wanted to be on that really analytical side. They're thinking the way that they wanted to think about science needed to be quite analytical as opposed to on the discovery side, which
Mhm.
the director of analytical chemistry was like, oh, that's the Wild West over there. They just do whatever they
Right.
want on discovery, right? And he
Mhm.
was like, no, in analytical, we drill down. We need to get to the very bottom of everything, and all has to be the same. And so it's sort of what is your personality type. But in graduate school, I did not know that there was a difference. I didn't realize that there were these different, wildly divergent career paths that people can take. So yeah, that's really interesting. What else were you? What else is on your radar?
Oh yeah, in terms of interesting sets. Oh, here's something that was kind of mind blowing to me. So being involved in like operations. So
Oh, yeah.
there's a position called an operations data engineer that I had no idea existed. So you're basically there are a wide variety of different roles that have like a similar title, but this was for a role where they were responsible for doing analytics for like warehouses.
Mm,
And there are several parts of this that were surprising to me. You can get a master's degree in those types of analytics, and you can also do a specialization in biotech, which
okay.
makes sense when you think about it. But it never occurred to me that you would have to, like, yeah, like for those large companies like Moderna, like making sure that you're getting the kinds of reagents that you need at the right time, and not having too much of it because then you don't want too many of your resources expiring, but also making sure that you have an entire month where you don't have enough media, to feed the cells so you can make your vaccine, and having a strong understanding of like refrigeration, during the pandemic, before vaccinations were available, refrigeration was a huge issue, especially when it came to dispersing the vaccine across the country.
Yeah.
So that type of perspective of, if you're a person who really loves multitasking and thinking of systems on a person and like countrywide or international level, I think is a really interesting career path as well, and like can be pretty lucrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that we're going to wrap things up, but I love this topic and we should certainly come back to it because I think that there are maybe people out there who are getting a certain type of a degree. They know what their interests are, but maybe they don't know what career path that looks like for them or what the options are. So we would love to hear from our audience, from you. Write in anything that you want about this. I'm studying chemistry. I'm a biochemist. What are your interests? And we'll try and sort of spotlight some of the jobs. I think that would be a really interesting series, sort of a career paths series. And we certainly know a lot of scientists in the industry that we could probably have on for a quick Q&A or at least get a soundbite from them. Like, how did you get here? What was your path?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, I would love that. One of my favorite things is looking at resumes and seeing this weird disconnect between like what the person got
Yes.
their degree in like 20 years ago and their current role, and seeing like all the different kinds of jumps that on a smaller scale seem feasible, but like after 20 years, like wow, like for example, how does someone who got a PhD in chemistry end up being the CFO
Hmm.
of a company, and understanding like, yeah, no, like at each level there's flexibility for growth, right? So you might start off as a scientist, become a senior scientist, but then once you're a director, you might be really involved in the budget for
Yeah.
your group, right? And then from there, your CSO said maybe you should get an MBA, and then you slowly start making trajectories towards something that you may have not even realized was an opportunity for you. So I think
Yeah.
it would actually be really cool to interview some of our clients and some of the scientists working from those organizations who have made really interesting careers for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I've yet to see a totally linear career path.
Yeah.
Like you always think, that you go to school and you're just like put one foot in front of another, but somehow you end up with the career path that looks like this, and that's okay. I think that's the
One
bottom
of
line.
one of the things that I love telling students or anyone who's really early in the career is that a degree is not a life sentence.
No, it really isn't. Well, thank you so much. This was really fun, and we'll do this maybe next week and have another career path talk. I love this.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to.
All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.